And while you're turning there, I want you to think about this question. If somebody asked you the story of how you became who you are, what would you tell them? One of the literary devices that's often used by professional writers is what's called an origin story. If you're unfamiliar with what that means, most writers explain it this way. An origin story is a backstory or established narrative that informs the identity and motivation of a person or a group of people. It was first used by comic book writers back in the 1930s and 40s, and the way it would work is with each successive issue, the writers would give more of the backstory away so that the reader finally understood, how Bruce Wayne became Batman or how Steve Rogers became Captain America. And since then, it's moved from the world of fiction to nonfiction. So businesses often have origin stories they use to talk about how they got started this time of year. Politicians love to use carefully crafted origin stories to show how relatable they are and why you should vote for them instead of the other guy. And it's not just individuals that have them, though. Each family has at least one origin story, or maybe several different versions of an origin story. One way to identify it is whenever the family gets together, these are the stories that get repeated, even though everybody's already heard them or different versions of them dozens of times. As a church family, we have an origin story that goes back a really long way. I've got a picture I want to show you. This is Raccoon John Smith. Some of you recognize him. Today, his cabin sits across the street, but back in the early 1800s, it was located several miles out of town in a remote part of Wayne County called Horse Hollow. It was during that time, a lot of people don't realize this, it was during that time that Raccoon John, one writer said anyway, was the most famous Baptist preacher in Kentucky, if not the most famous Baptist preacher in the United States. He was kind of a national figure, even though he was right here in our own county. By the late 1820s, though, something started to change for Raccoon. It happened when he started reading the writings of two different guys, Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone, who were in different parts of the country, but who were essentially saying the same thing. And their message was really simple. They said, instead of being divided into dozens of different denominations based on differences of opinion related to secondary issues, the church should really be united around its common commitment to Jesus. So rather than being Baptist or Methodist or Pentecostal or any other of the signifiers that we use today, we should all just be Christians. And something about that really resonated with Raccoon John, and he soon adopted that as his approach. The problem, though, is that he was living in a world in which those dividing lines ran pretty deep. And so what happened is all of the churches that used to invite him in when he was a famous preacher began to shut him out. And not only did they shut him out, some of them actually worked really hard to try and discredit him. So not only were they shutting him out, they were working against him. So next time you get into it with a neighbor that goes to a Baptist church, just remember that's been going on a long time. I'm kidding, kind of. Anyway, it was somewhere around the end of 1830 that after starting a couple other churches out in the county, Raccoon John came to town, and he decided to try and start a church that would be known only as a Christian church. So he held Bible studies, he preached sermons, and for several weeks he gave it his best shot, and nobody responded. And so after a couple months of this, he left town so discouraged and so defeated that he packed up and he moved, and he left Wayne County and he went to Montgomery County, which is Mount Sterling, Kentucky, where he once again attempted to start a new congregation that would be known only as a Christian church. Now, in one sense, you could say that the origin story of our congregation is a story that's rooted in a failed attempt to recapture something that John Smith and many of his contemporaries felt had been tragically lost. And that brings us to Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5, we're starting a new series called Roof Crashers, and the whole chapter is built around one famous story about these four friends who come together to bring their friend to Jesus. Remember the story? They get there, it's so crowded, they can't get in, and they have to tear a hole in the roof. But that's a story everybody kind of knows from this part, from this chapter. But surrounding that story are three other stories that all give texture and add depth to that primary story. So what we're going to do during the month of August as we transition from summer into the school season is just look at these four stories and answer the question, what kind of church is this? Or more importantly, we could ask the question, what kind of church are we striving to become? And to answer that question, you have to go back a lot further than 1830. In fact, you have to go all the way to the beginning. If you want to know what the church is supposed to look like now, you have to go back to what it looked like then. And so in Luke chapter 5, what you find are these origin stories, these family stories of what the church was supposed to look like from the very beginning. As the chapter opens, Jesus is standing next to the Sea of Galilee, and he literally has hundreds, if not a couple thousand people gathered around him. So I've got a picture. I want to show you the Sea of Galilee. And what makes this so unique is because the sea level, the surface of the water is nearly 700 feet below sea level, and it's surrounded on all sides by these 1,000-foot mountains. It serves kind of as a natural amphitheater. So he's got these people gathered around him. Everybody can hear him. So Jesus seizes this opportunity to try and pour himself into the crowd. So with that in mind, I want you to look at how this story begins in verse 1 of Luke chapter 5. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. Now, there's 2 things I want you to catch right off the bat. The first is that this is one of only a handful of stories that appears in all 4 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the reason it's there is because this was an event that burned itself deep into the memories of the people that experienced. So even years later, as they were thinking about their relationship with God and their experiences with Jesus, this was something they kept going back to. The other thing that's important to understand about this event is that it happens right near the beginning of what we call Jesus' public ministry. So right from the beginning, as Jesus launches, he's ready to go public. Behind the scenes, he's very intentionally starting to put together this thing that we call the church as he prepares these people for what he wants the future to look like. So you have these people who've gathered around Jesus, a few hundred, maybe a couple thousand. They're listening to him teach. And over here off to the side, there's this group of commercial fishermen who are cleaning their nets after a long night spent out on the water. And the way it worked is they would fish at night, just like they do now. If you go to the beach, you see the ships coming in and out. They would fish at night. And then when the sun came up, they would end their shift, and then they would go, and they would spend at least a couple hours cleaning all the grass and trash and dirt out of the nets so that they'd be ready to go for the next shift. So one way to think about this is whatever part of your job that you hate most, that's what washing the nets was to these guys. This is not something they enjoyed doing, but it's something they had to do in order to pay their bills. So here's Jesus teaching this crowd, and over here you've got this group of guys that are in the process of doing the exact same thing that so many of us spend our days doing, and that's that they're trying to figure out how to make it all work. So they get up every morning, or they get up in the afternoon, they go to their job, they're trying to make enough money to provide for their families. At the same time, they're trying to be good dads and good husbands and good people, and how they're trying to figure out how to achieve their goals and make this thing that we call life fit together in a way that works, just like you do. The other thing that's happening for these guys is that underneath all of that, they're wrestling with some questions that they don't know how to answer. And the reason we know that's true is because they're the same questions that so many of us struggle to answer. Questions like, where did I come from? Why am I here? Is this all there is to it, or is there more to life than what I'm experiencing? And then, of course, the most important question of all, where does God fit into all of of this thing that I call life. Jesus, of course, knows all this. So you get to verse 4, and he turns his attention to a guy named Simon. You know him better as Peter. I want you to check this out. Verse 4, when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into deep water and let the nets down for a catch. Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. I love that answer that Peter gives Jesus in verse 5 because it's just so raw. He says, hey man, we've already done all of this. Like we've already done everything we know to do, and it didn't work. Like we came up empty, right? We've been out there, we've done this, we're professionals, we know what it's supposed to look like, and this is not it. Now, my suspicion is you've probably, at some point in your life, used some version of that same statement. It might not have anything to do with fishing, but you know how it goes. So it may have went something like this. Jesus, I've done everything I know to do in my career, and yet even all these years after that, I'm still stuck in this dead-end job. Or maybe for you, it's, I've worked hard to build a healthy family, and I read all the books and listened to all the podcasts, and we're just as dysfunctional now as we ever were. Or I've done everything I know to do to find somebody to date, and I'm still single. I've tried hard to get control of my finances or get physically healthy or to take my spiritual life to a new level, and I've done everything I know to do. I did everything people told me to do, and here I am, and I've got nothing to show for it. That's where Peter and these guys were. It's that place that all of us have been, and some of you may be there right now, where this deep disappointment turns into frustration. That's where they were. And it's interesting that of all the people that Jesus could have chosen to start this thing that we call the church with, he chose to start with a group of frustrated fishermen. I don't know about you, but that gives me hope, because I read these stories about these guys and I think, well, if Jesus can use them, then maybe he can use us. So as you unpack this story, there are 4 things that are part of this sort of early portrait of the church. And here's the first one. The church should be a place of unquestioning obedience. If you look at this from Simon's perspective, or Peter's perspective, he had every reason to say no to Jesus. Just put yourself in his shoes. Not only is he tired, he's been out all night, and not only is he frustrated, Luke lets us know that Peter was the owner of the boat, which means he's at least part owner of this fishing operation, which means he's got a lot of expenses. He's got employees to pay. He's got taxes and insurance to cover. He's got maintenance costs. He's got all the overhead that comes with running a commercial fishing operation. And over the previous 12 hours, they haven't caught a single fish. So that means, from Peter's perspective, there's a whole lot of money going out, and there's no money coming in. Now, if you're a business owner, then you know if you have too many days like that, it's not long until you're out of business. And now he's got this mysterious rabbi who shows up, and his big idea for Peter's business is to take the nets that they just finished cleaning and the crew that just got off work, call them back in, put them on overtime, and go back out and start over. Now, make sure you understand, nothing about this makes any sense. And yet you get to the end of verse 5, and Peter does something that goes completely against everything he knows as a fisherman and as a businessman, and he agrees to do it. Master, we've worked hard all night. We haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I'll let down the nets. Let me ask you, when's the last time you did something just because Jesus told you to do it? Or how about this? When's the last time you made a decision that cost you something, maybe money, maybe something else, all for the simple reason that Jesus told you to do it? See, one of the mistakes that a lot of us make is that we want Jesus to be more like an advisor than a master. And those are two different things. See, an advisor comes in, and an advisor makes suggestions. And you take those suggestions under consideration, and you see how it fits with your other priorities, and then at the end, you make a decision about whether or not you want to accept that suggestion. But a master comes in, and they don't offer suggestions. A master issues instructions. And one of the things we learn from this story, right at the beginning, this ground floor that we call the church, these early followers of Jesus, they never saw Jesus as an advisor. They never saw Jesus as somebody who makes suggestions. Instead, they saw him as a master whose commands they were expected to obey. And so as a church, there are certain things that we're supposed to do. Check this out. Make sure you catch this. There are certain things that we're supposed to do, not because we feel like doing them, but because Jesus said you're supposed to do them. And there are certain things that we're supposed to do, not because we ran the numbers and all the math adds up. Instead, there are certain things that we're supposed to do simply because Jesus tells us to do them. And if he's really your master, rather than just an advisor, then your role is not to take his suggestions, but to follow his commands. Now, here's the second thing you see in this portrait of the church, and it goes with the first one. It's a deep sense of awe. Check out what happens in verse 6. So they take Jesus, they follow his command, they go back out. Here's what happens. When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And when they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken, and so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. This is a picture of what can happen when Jesus steps into somebody's life. You can go from empty to overflowing quicker than you ever imagined. But keep in mind, from one angle, nothing really changes. Same boat, same nets, same dudes fishing, same lake. I mean, even the same fish. You can say nothing really changed except for the fact that Jesus was now part of the story. And when he's part of the story, that changes everything. But I don't want to get hung up there because it's what happens next in verse 8 that I think is the real thrust of this story. Because rather than obsessing over this massive haul of fish that was now threatening to sink his boat, Simon Peter does something that seems like a strange reaction to what should have been a happy moment. Rather than like high-fiving the guys and rather than everybody starting to count the fish and everybody, now they're going to get paid, and they might not just get paid, they might even get a bonus. Rather than worrying about everything that he was worried about before, you know what he does? He falls on his knees and he worships Jesus. And one thing you see in Scripture is that any time a person has a real encounter with God, they always have a similar reaction. There's this great scene, Isaiah chapter 6 in the Old Testament, which the prophet Isaiah is given this glimpse, this vision of God's throne room. And here's the way he described, here's his reaction. He said, Isaiah 6, "Woe to me, I cried, I am ruined." Same thing Peter went through. "For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." For Isaiah, there was something about seeing just the throne room that caused him to come apart at the seams. It's the same thing that happened to Peter. Well, let me ask you, when's the last time you had an encounter with God that made you forget about everything else? When's the last time you were in the middle of a worship experience and all of a sudden you were just overwhelmed with a sense of God's holiness compared to your own sinfulness? See, one of the things that define these early followers of Jesus is that they lived and worked and worshiped not with the casualness that sometimes defines us, but with this deep sense of awe as to who God is and what God is up to. And that leads to the third thing you see in this passage, and that's that these early followers of Jesus lived with a really clear mission. In verse 10, Jesus invites Peter to spend the rest of his life helping other people experience what he's just experienced. The Bible says it this way. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." Now, if you know the rest of his story, you know Peter from that moment forward really does spend the rest of his life fishing for people. So you keep reading through the rest of Luke, then you read in through Acts, which is kind of like volume 2 to Luke, and you can trace the expansion of God's kingdom, and it goes from being this geographical oddity that's confined to just one region, and over time it becomes this global movement, and Peter plays a leading role in all that. I've got a picture I want to show you. Some of you may recognize this. This is what's called an ichthus symbol. Ichthus is the Greek word for fish. And what's so cool about this is that the members of the early church, they took that word and they created an acrostic. And it doesn't make sense in English, but if you see it in Greek, it makes sense. And the acrostic read this: said, "Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior." And then over time, as the persecution from the Roman Empire began to intensify, the early church began to use this symbol as kind of a secret symbol to identify these hidden places where the church would gather to worship that was out of the public eye. One of the other things they would do, whenever somebody wandered into one of those gatherings, or if there was a question about somebody, they would have one of the believers sort of nonchalantly draw out the first half of this fish, and it was assumed that if the other person they were talking to was a true believer, they would be able to finish the drawing. This is a symbol that became so ingrained of the early church. It became like this visual password that the early believers used to identify one another. And so the question is, like, where did that come from? How did they come up with this? And it came from this story. For those early believers, they were so clear about what their mission is and what they're supposed to be doing that they adopted the symbol of a fish as their symbol. It was like their logo. Now compare that to us. So if you've been coming here for almost any length of time, you know I rarely, if ever, reuse stories. I don't like to do that. I try to find new stuff, but there's one that I've used lots of times over the years, and I never can get away from it. I keep a printed copy of this in my desk, and I'll pull it out and I'll read it every once in a while, because to me it perfectly captures what can happen to a church. I'm going to read this to you. Some of you heard this before. It's titled "Fishermen Who Don't Fish." Here's what it says. "Now it came to pass that a group existed who called themselves fishermen. And as it happened, there were many fish in the waters all around. In fact, the whole area was surrounded by streams and lakes filled with fish. And the fish were hungry. Week after week, month after month, and year after year, those who called themselves fishermen met in meetings and talked about their call to fish, the abundance of fish, and how they might go about fishing. Year after year, they carefully defined what fishing means, defended fishing as an occupation, and declared that fishing is always to be the primary task of fishermen. Continually, they searched for new and better methods of fishing and new and better definitions of fishing. They created witty slogans and displayed them on big, beautiful banners. These fishermen built large, beautiful buildings called fishing headquarters. The plea was that everyone should be a fisherman and that every fisherman should fish. One thing they didn't do, however, they did not fish. In addition to meeting regularly, they organized a board to send out fishermen to other places where there were many fish. The board hired staff and appointed committees and held many meetings to define fishing, defend fishing, and decide what new streams should be thought about. But the staff and committee members did not fish. Large, elaborate, and expensive training centers were built whose original and primary purpose was to teach fishermen how to fish. Over the years, courses were offered on the needs of fish, the nature of fish, where to find fish, the psychological reactions of fish, and how to approach and feed fish. Those who taught had doctorates in fishology, but the teachers did not fish. They only taught fishing. Year after year, after tedious training, many were graduated and given fishing licenses. They were sent to do full-time fishing, some to distant waters which were filled with fish. Many felt the call to be fishermen responded. They were commissioned and sent to fish. But like the fishermen back home, they never fished. They engaged in all kinds of other occupations. Some felt their job was to relate to the fish in a good way so the fish would know the difference between good and bad fishermen. Others felt that simply letting the fish know they were nice, land-loving neighbors and how loving and kind they could be was enough. Now, it's true that many of the fishermen sacrificed and put up with all kinds of difficulties. Some lived near the water and bore the smell of dead fish every day. They received the ridicule of some who made fun of their fishermen's clubs and the fact that they claimed to be fishermen, yet they never fished. Imagine how hurt some were one day when a person suggested that those who don't fish are not really fishermen, no matter how much they claim to be. Yet it did sound correct. Is a person a fisherman if year after year he never fishes? Let me ask you, when is the last time that you went fishing? When's the last time you had an intentional conversation with somebody who was far from God in hopes of helping them find their way back to God? Can you remember? And if you can't, you might be a fisherman that doesn't fish. Now, there's one more thing you see in this passage. It's easy to overlook this because it's just a few, it's one little line, but it changes the whole story. And that's this: the church should be a place that's defined by unrestrained surrender. I want you to look at the last line of this little passage in verse 11. It says, "So they pulled their boats up on shore, they left everything, and followed him." Now, I'm convinced that if that had been some of us, we probably would have had a different response, right? I mean, keep in mind, here's Peter. He's a small business owner. He's got this commercial fishing operation. He's just finished hauling in this record number of fish. So if that had been some of us, rather than like leaving everything and following Jesus, we would have quickly formulated a new business plan in which Jesus would become a part of what we're trying to do rather than us become a part of what he's trying to do. So you can almost imagine the conversation, because some of you have had conversations similar to this. So you go to Jesus. "Okay, Jesus, here's my offer. Monday through Friday, we want you on the boat with us, helping us to find all the fish. Then at the end of the week, here's what we'll do. Using the average of that week's fish market values, we'll give you 35% of whatever we make that week. And then if you want to take Saturday off, that's fine. And then you can kind of preach on Sundays. You can do the spiritual thing on Sunday. But Monday through Friday, we want you with us. We want you to bless what we're doing rather than us get involved in what you're doing. That way, you'll make a lot of money, we'll make a lot of money, and you can still do the spiritual thing on the weekends. And if that doesn't do you for you, maybe we can push it up to 38%, but that's as high as we're going." I mean, some of you had those conversations. And just like some of us tend to view Jesus as more of an advisor than a master, you know what else we do? A lot of us tend to view our relationship with Jesus as more of an add-on to our lives rather than letting him play the leading role. Let's just be honest. A lot of us have spent our lives asking Jesus to bless what we're trying to do rather than us getting involved in what he's trying to do. But in a church, it needs to be different. See, rather than viewing Jesus as an advisor, he's our master. And rather than asking him to give us success in achieving our goals, we're supposed to surrender and allow him to rewrite the story and rewrite the agenda for our lives. And when we do that, he promises to come in and do things that we could never imagine. I've got one last picture I want to show you. As far as I know, this is the earliest picture of the building that we're setting in this morning. I don't know the date, but if you look closely, you can see the road in front of the building, which is Michigan Avenue, is dirt. Hadn't even been paved yet. And this building that we're setting in was built in 1915. It's the third building that's housed our church. The first two buildings burned. And if you go back even further than 1915, you go back to the summer of 1831. It was a few months after leaving Monticello that Raccoon John received a letter from an unnamed citizen. So he's up in Mount Sterling. Somebody that was unnamed here in Monticello wrote him a letter and encouraged him to come back and give it another shot. Now, Van Phillips referenced this in our elders meeting. I don't think he wrote the letter, but I do think he knew a lot about it. So if you have questions about this, you can talk to Van. So October of 1831, Raccoon John comes back to Monticello after being up in Montgomery County. And he starts preaching to this small group of people. And he's meeting with this small group of people. And when he's done, there's 9 people who are baptized, and they become the inaugural members of what we call First Christian Church. The problem, though, for those people is that those same lines of division that just a few months earlier had kind of run Raccoon John out of town still existed. And I want you to listen to how one historian described their situation. Here's what it said. "What shall we do now?" said those 9 disciples after they had been immersed. "No church here will receive us, and we have no one to teach us." Now, here's Raccoon's reply. He said, "Meet every Lord's Day. If others occupy the meeting house, meet in your own houses and gather around your own firesides. If you cannot exhort one another, pray together. And if you cannot do that, read the book and sing." And then listen to these last couple lines. So, "They followed his advice and grew in grace and knowledge, and soon one of them began to speak in public, much to the comfort and edification of the little church." Now, fast forward 192 years, and we're still here, meeting every Sunday, trying our best to do what Raccoon wanted us to do. We sing together, we encourage one another, hopefully we teach one another from the Scriptures. And so what started out as this story of failure became eventually a story of incredible faithfulness by God to accomplish his agenda. But here's my challenge to you. The story's not over. Like, there are a lot more people in Monticello today that need to know about Jesus than there ever were when Raccoon was here. And so the mission is not complete. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm hopeful that the best days of our church are still in the future. But the only way for that to happen, the only way for us to experience that overflow that only Jesus can bring, is if we go back to the beginning and we try our best to become the church that God created us to be. I want you to stand with me. From one perspective, the summer of 2023 has been the best summer we've ever experienced as a church, at least since Raccoon was here. And we're hopeful that's what's happened over these summer months will serve as a springboard into a better fall. But for that to happen, all of us have to allow God's mission to become our mission. We have to, rather than asking Him to bless what we're doing, we have to surrender ourselves to what to what He's trying to do. So if you're here this morning and you've never done that, or if it's been a really long time since you've done that, we want to invite you to do that today. And some of you are here right now, and you're here every weekend, and you may even be like serving in some ministry area, and that's great. But for whatever reason, you've never officially like joined the team. You've never, you're part of the team. You're here. You're part of the family, but you've never actually joined the team. And if that's your situation, I'm not trying to beat you up. I'm really not. But it's hard if you played sports growing up. It's hard to say, boy, I'm committed to the game, but I'm not going to join the team. That usually doesn't work for very long. So if you're here and you know the Lord is calling you to make this your church home, we want to encourage you to do that. If you're a baptized believer, it's very simple. There's no votes. You just come up and we talk to you, and we'll make that happen. Others of you may be here, and you're kind of like Peter was at the end of his shift. You've got more questions than you have answers. And the one thing you know for certain is whatever you're doing is not working. If you have questions about how it might work better or what you can do differently, I'd love to talk to you. David's here, John's here. We'd love to pray with you. Some of you are putting off a decision that you know you need to make. A little later today, after the second service, we're hopefully going to baptize a lady in a wheelchair. She has a very significant health struggle, and this is something she's put off a long time. And now that she's come to what very well could be the end of her life, she's ready to make a decision. But I want to encourage you, if you're in that same boat, you don't have to wait till the end of your life. You can turn this thing around long before you ever get to that point. Because the scary thing is you don't know when that point's going to come. So if there's something you need to do, some decision you need to make, some conversation that you need to have, some prayer that you need to pray, we want to encourage you to do that now. Don't wait. And we'll be glad to help you. If you need to talk to us, we'll be on these front rows.